and where he had been free to wander wherever he liked, and then it was being basically parceled up and privatized. And to me, his poetry, well, it's absolutely exquisite in itself, but it also tells that wider story, I think, about our relationship to the land and how many centuries that goes back and how it's so central to our identity in many ways. And there are plenty of movements today that are still trying to get more access to the land. And I'm very involved in the Right to Roam campaign, which points out that when it comes to England specifically, we only have a statutory right of access to around 8% of the land and 3% of the rivers. Contrast that to Scotland, where the assumption is exactly the other way around, that you have a right of responsible access unless there's a good reason otherwise, and sometimes there is a good reason if there are ground nesting birds, for example. But I wanted to kind of trace this idea of how important the land is to us and how strange England is in the sense that 50% of the land is owned by just 1% of the population. And going right back to John Clare just reminds us again about how that kind of fight for land access has been going on for such a long time. And what I loved about his poetry is actually something that's slightly related to that, which is about trying to explain how, as a nation of country lovers, of nature lovers, how is it that we are also one of the most nature depleted countries in the world? And one of the answers to that question, I think, is because we also see nature as being separate from us. We don't necessarily see ourselves as part of nature. Whereas John Clare did, and what I love about some of his poems is the way in which the syntax itself of the poems literally totally muddle up where the subject is, the author writing about nature, and the nature he's writing about. Subclause after subclause pile up conjunctions and connections, so that you're totally immersed in the end in this poem where you've lost track of who is doing the observing and what is being observed. And it almost feels like in the very language that he uses, he's kind of encapsulating that idea of our interdependence with the natural world. And again, there's a way of bringing that back to where we are today as well, because there's a campaign going on at the moment to try to persuade the Oxford English Dictionary to change its definition of nature, because the OED defines nature in its primary definition as the living world separate from, other than, human beings. And this little campaign from Lawyers for Nature is basically just saying, well, hang on a minute, why don't we use one of these obsolete definitions of nature, which included humanity within the definition of nature, and make that the primary one? And that just, to me, I mean, it's a tiny little microcosm, but it speaks to this wider understanding that if we saw ourselves as part of the natural world, interdependent with it, you know, utterly dependent upon it, then maybe our attitude to it would be different. And I think John Clare knew that back in the 1830s in a way that we're still struggling to know it today.
And that reminds me, when you say that the OED is on the process of changing the concept of nature, because in one of the manifestos of Green Party, isn't there's a borderline of openings where we are part of nature, where the element of nature and the interaction is it's a separate antagonism. So I remember something like that in manifesto, which is reads as great literary text, you know, at the same time. Caroline, I wonder if you can read a little bit just to give us a flavor. Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to explain that the reason, in a way, for writing about England in particular is this very real possibility, in my view at least, that England could be on our own much sooner than we think, by which I mean, notwithstanding the travails of the Scottish National Party, I think that support for independence in Scotland is still very high. If you look at what's happening in Northern Ireland, then Sinn Féin are now the majority party, and they've said very clearly they're expecting there to be some kind of referendum on reuniting the island of Ireland by 2030. Even in Wales, there's a new sense of nationalism, I think, on the rise. And it just strikes me as kind of typical, in a way, that in all the other nations of the UK, there's a very live debate going on about what is the future of these islands. Whereas in England, we just kind of muddle along, you know, often thinking that England is Britain anyway, so why does it matter? And it just feels like we're really missing quite an important issue. And so I start the book, trigger alert, it's about Brexit. I start the book just in the aftermath of that referendum. London at dawn. The Thames is in full flood. Its muddy waters turned to a deep blue by the cloudless sky above. The rising sun is picking out every detail of the Palace of Westminster, its honey-coloured limestone now golden, transforming what is too often a museum of pomp and empty circumstance into something startlingly beautiful. I'm standing on Westminster Bridge, looking east towards the towers of the City of London, to Essex and Kent, and beyond to Europe. I'm there to film a short message, and now as I watch the recording again 8 years later, I realize I look like someone who has just heard of the death of a friend or a relative. I am profoundly sad, perhaps a little shocked. I'm also deeply tired because I've been up all night. I look like I don't quite know what to say. I say, I know, like me, you'll be feeling pretty devastated this morning. Just a few hours earlier, I'd watched David Dimbleby report the results of the referendum on the UK's continuing membership of the European Union. After all the millions of words spent during the campaign, the result came at 4:39 a.m. on the 24th of June 2016. We're out. Sometimes when you're tired or in shock, things can gain a strange clarity. And I say people have voted the way they did, I think, partly because they were feeling so angry and alienated, and the divisions in this country run so deep. And if we're ever to have a chance of healing those divisions, the progressives have got to work together. And in one way, that moment on Westminster Bridge feels a lifetime ago. Our country has gone through so much since, and if anything, the alienation and polarization are much greater today than back in 2016. But the truth was clear even then. Brexit was the result of division, and it would make those divisions worse. The fact that England and Wales voted to leave and Scotland and Northern Ireland to stay has put incredible strain on the myth that the United Kingdom is an equal partnership of 4 nations. The government in London decided what form Brexit would take without any reference to the elected governments in Edinburgh or Belfast or indeed in Cardiff. Unsurprisingly, support for the reunification of Ireland has grown. The pressure for a second independence referendum in Scotland can't be ignored forever. In Wales, a new sense of national identity is on the rise. The future of the United Kingdom itself is now in doubt.
So that opens a great can of worm. First thing we were talking about, your book is actually futuristic because after Brexit, so next thing we're expecting Ireland will be united within, I don't know how many years, you guys will know better. So Ireland become one, so losing Northern Ireland, and then followed by a Scottish referendum another time. Then England indeed become on its own. So what you read suggests, Ireland before the Brexit, all the environmental legislation, more like 90% environmental legal policies from EU. So what have you been witnessed after Brexit as a Labour leader till last year? Are we out of completely the policy loop because we separated now from the EU?
Yes, I mean, in spite of all of the pledges to the contrary from Boris Johnson, so perhaps that's not so surprising, but anyway, he promised that there would be no dilution of environmental policy when we left the EU, and yet already we can see that that is happening in a very significant way. So, for example, if you take the issue of chemicals, the EU has gone ahead and regulated far more chemicals now than we have in terms of having a safety standards for them. If it comes to pesticides, again, we now allow far more potentially dangerous pesticides than the EU does. On things like water regulation and air regulation, we're already beginning to be out of sync with them as well. So I think there is a very real concern that our environmental laws are being watered down, and that's going to be even more the case with this new planning and infrastructure bill that the government is trying to bring in. This is where they're having their big fight about gnats and not gnats, bats. I always get that wrong. Bats and newts. I always say gnats and anyway, those things, bats and newts, which they kind of claim is stopping development, and so they're going to now drive a horse and coach and horses through through the Habitats Directive, which was this directive that used to protect land from development in certain circumstances. So I think there is a real concern there around what's going to happen on environmental legislation for sure.
It's really worrying, isn't it? Because this is tied to the Brexit, the whole kind of disentanglement of the legalization, right? The legislation with the EU. Another thing I was wondering about, I mean, the powerful Green Party at the moment seems to be the best time, in a way, to join the membership of the Green Party because the whole situation is so catastrophic. But also we were mentioning, you know, compared with Germany, what's the numbers? Like 160,000 Green Party members, and in the UK now it's around 60,000 or more.
Yeah.
But the problem is because you're not including the Scottish Green membership, and so that is contradiction in a way. And how do you see that sort of separation in order to have political power in a major play currently? And it will be disaster after Labour, say, the next election, if the right wing gets in. I mean, what's the vision of the Green Labour Party? Green Party, no, well, Green Labour, that could be interesting coalition. I mean, I keep thinking of Green Labour, the Green First. So, yeah, what's your vision about expanding? I know you are no longer doing the major policy, but it's really in our thinking, you know, how can we support the Green in a way, in such a, yeah.
I mean, I think the reason that, for example, the Greens traditionally have done so much better in many other European countries, and Germany probably one of the most obvious ones, is because of two things. One is proportional representation, a fairer voting system, and the other is state funding for political parties. So in Germany, once you get beyond a certain threshold in terms of the number of votes you get, then the state pays the money. So you don't have to spend your time on running, you know, jumble sales to raise money for your party, or indeed go and get very, very rich donors who then demand policy change in return. You actually get state funding for political parties. So I think that's made a big difference in Europe. Here in the UK, I mean, it's a really interesting question to think what would happen if England were on its own in terms of the electoral system then, because you might remember that the Labour Party membership actually did vote in favour of fairer votes at a conference a couple of years ago, but Keir Starmer decided to overrule them. But I mean, I think if England were on its own, it might just dawn on Labour that actually they would do better if they had a system of proportional representation as well. So that, I mean, that might be one of the outputs of that change in terms of the UK coming apart in that way. I mean, my hope, of course, is that Labour would do the right thing much sooner than that and not wait for that, and to introduce a fairer voting system. And I think, you know, to the extent that it's now not impossible to say the words Nigel Farage might become the next Prime Minister, this ought to be concentrating all of our minds. And ironically, I think under a proportional system, actually, we would have a better chance of ensuring that he didn't become the next Prime Minister than under first past the post, because you can run a government on around 30% under first past the post, whereas under a fairer voting system, you could have coalitions coming together to say we don't want the hard right, far right, depending on what you want to call them, but that they are not a party like any other, and there is a firewall. So my hope is that that Labour starts to read the writing on the wall and to recognise that it needs to change quite a lot of things, one of the things being the voting system, but also just the way in which I feel that so many of the policy choices they're making just now are actually, in a sense, laying out the red carpet for reform. And until they get a better story to tell, coming back to the theme of the book in a way about telling stories about who we are and where we're going, and until they do that, then I really do worry about what will happen at the next election for sure.
Yes, it's already very worrying. But before we shift completely to the political struggle of the world now, I just want to also mention how rich your book suggests as a whole English literary history. The way it's interesting when I say we, you see, Caroline. I feel British, but I don't feel English as an immigrant. And it's interesting, your book is so nuanced, sort of challenged the idea of our relationship to the land. When we say our, again, us, I don't really question much. I thought I'm one of the British, but it's so focused on who owns England in the past and who owns now, past tense. Also, I think very crucial, there's one chapter you mentioned, we can't afford the nostalgia about the old English landscape and the beauty of the land. And it's catastrophic at the moment. What do we need to do with the situation, nuclear power, all that stuff? I think you talk about also the untransparent registration. I think one section was stunning. You talk about 19th century. We knew 5,000 English families own most of the land. And now we couldn't know because Parliament decided that they don't need to register who owns most of the land. And we know what you said, something like 80% of the English land owned by those families. So that just my question lead to Right to Roam and Dartmoor, the now recently the legal campaign Dartmoor. Could you,
You've covered a lot in that question. Sorry. The first thing I just wanted to pick up, because I think it is really important, is the way in which for people from other nationalities and other ethnic backgrounds, I totally understand why an identification with Britain perhaps feels more comfortable than an identification with England. And I think it's worth thinking about why that is. So for example, on forms and so forth, you might have a box that would say, Black British, but wouldn't say Black English, let's say. And I think that's just quite interesting in the way in which Britain has been constructed as a kind of a construct that is more accessible, perhaps, in the sense that England can often seem very ethnically defined. And I want to move away from that. I don't want to see England being ethnically defined. I want to see England being for whoever lives in England. But it just feels to me that in any average audience, if you ask people, do they identify most with Britain or England? We could try it, but usually the answer is most people would define themselves first as British, which is fine because we can all have multiple identities. But I just think it is interesting just how much many of us feel a bit squeamish about identifying with England, and it just feels potentially a little bit unhealthy, which is not to say that we can't have loads of different identities, and certainly our local identity is massively important too. And one of the things I talk about in the book is just how centralized England is, and how we've lost some of that kind of local identity, and how you can see now in a number of different resurrections of different kind of festivals, for example, apple festivals or the Brixton Pound or different ways of trying to link with a local identity is now coming back up the agenda, as I think people feel that that's somewhere where they can feel a sense of belonging, and that really matters. So yes, that's just simply to say that I think there are lots of different identities that we can relate to, but I do think it's interesting that because, I would argue, England has tended to be defined in a very ethnic way rather than a civic way, then it becomes a concept which is much more problematic. And I think trying to tell different stories about England might be one way of making that a slightly less toxic concept than some people would think it is. Not everybody, but certainly I think some on the left would feel that way. And then you were talking about land and the right to roam. And actually there's some unusually good news for once, which is that this issue around getting access to the information about who owns land in England, it used to be massively expensive, so nobody did it. It would cost you thousands and thousands of pounds. The wonderful writer Guy Shrubsole, who's done so much work in this space around who owns the land, has been campaigning for a long time to make it much less expensive to find out who owns England, and he and others have now been successful. So that will now change. So we will be able to have a better sense of who owns the country. But it was, for quite a long time, this really odd situation where it was actually really hard to work out who owns which bit of land. And I guess another bit of good news, because we don't always have good news to talk about, is that the famous case around the right to wild camp on Dartmoor went to appeal, and now the final result has been that there is indeed a right to wild camp in Dartmoor. So the challenge now, of course, is to expand that beyond Dartmoor so that we can have a right to wild camp on land further afield than just Dartmoor. But those are two bits of good news, which I think is
Hopefully
important
more
to
things
celebrate.
follow from that more
Yeah.
the rights to camping, and the room. I mean, another thing I want to ask you before I like to open up soon. I think my admiration to the Green Party when you were there, well, you're still there, is your boldness, your clear vision, say no more GDP growth. And you suggested it's zero growth, but the growth on the eco-friendly growth, the replacement, the energy, the new energy. And I think current language is the growth. We go Turkey with growth, right? I love the language because every government is scared of not growth. There's no growth in the GDP. And I thought, could you talk about that? And if we don't have economic growth, can you unpack the idea? What other kind of growth can replace the GDP growth?
I mean, I think our position is not quite as black and white as that, in the sense that I think what we're challenging is, growth of what, for whom, at what cost, and who benefits, really. And I think what we want to challenge is that this idea that you hear from every single commentator just about, which is that, and you certainly hear from the Prime Minister, which is all about growth, 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 and without very much analysis of what exactly is growing and who's benefiting from it. I mean, I think in a green economy, certainly some things will need to grow. We want to see a massive investment in renewable energy, for example. So we're going to see plenty of growth in that. But I think the point is that not everything can grow at the same time on a planet of finite resources. There was a wonderful economist, Kenneth Boulding, who years ago said anyone who thinks that infinite economic growth is possible on a planet of finite resources is either a madman or an economist. And I think he had a point. So if you're going to see growth in certain sectors, let's say in the cement and so forth that we're going to need for more wind turbines, then that has to be matched by some degrowth somewhere else. And we would be very happy to see a degrowth, for example, in road building or in the expansion of airports. But I just feel that we need to be bringing a more nuanced position to the issue of growth and recognizing that there are better ways of measuring our well-being than simply being focused on gross domestic product alone. And many bigger brains than mine have spent a lot of time thinking about what would a basket of indicators look like that would be a better representation of whether or not as a society things are getting better or worse. And so things like, for example, the number of girls at school, or the quality of the air that we breathe, or people's self-reported well-being versus an epidemic of mental ill health. So I think there are all kinds of things that we could talk about that need to grow in terms of well-being and flourishing, at the same time as being a lot more nuanced about whether or not growth for its own sake is really going to bring about the benefits that are claimed for it. Because there are plenty of analysts who would say that the growth that happens in terms of the kind of trickle-down theory, well, it takes a hell of a long time to trickle down to the people who need it most, and actually far more of it is ring-fenced and benefited from for those people who are higher up that economic chain.
And if we should focus on the renewable energy growth, which kind of bring me to think about the nuclear power. Do you think we can talk about that? Because you were one of the ladies being arrested when you were right detested. When was that exactly? Quite long ago.
Yeah, I've been arrested so many times. I can't
Quite
remember.
a few times.
And I think that was in the early 80s, which was up at Faz Lane, when
in the north,
in the north, in Scotland, in fact, where the nuclear submarines are based. Sorry, that's nuclear weapons rather than power. But the two are linked. I mean, I am worried about the government's new rush for nuclear power just now. I mean, on so many grounds, I think it's dangerous and unnecessary. I mean, if someone were to kind of put me up against the wall and say, do you want climate change or nuclear power? Yes, if that were the choice, I'd go for nuclear power, but that is not the choice. In many ways, you could argue that actually nuclear power is going to be a distraction from the investment that we urgently need into renewables, into battery technologies, into the interconnectors that will enable us better to transfer energy between countries depending on when it's windy here or windy in Spain. We need far more investment in home energy efficiency. I can't believe how many years many of us have been banging on about let's just try and reduce the amount of energy we need to use in the first place, which would get people's fuel bills down as well and keep their homes warmer in winter and cooler in summer. So there are so many things that we should be doing before going to nuclear power, which is incredibly expensive, incredibly slow, uses huge amounts of water for cooling at a time when we don't have a lot of water, often situated on the coast when we know that there's sea level rise, often being concerned about whether that could then also become a terrorist target, because don't forget that on 9/11, one of those planes, before it was stopped, was on its way to a nuclear power station. So for all kinds of reasons, it just feels to me as if nuclear power is absolutely an unnecessary and a dangerous distraction.
I know. So we were mentioning yesterday, the government just kind of announced that they're going to put how much to build a nuclear weapon. Is that what?
So nuclear weapons, you've got the government talking about an extra £15 billion that they want to put into upgrading our nuclear weapons. And this is not entirely on topic with the book, but just quickly to say
Totally,
in parenthesis, I mean, I was ready to throw something very large and heavy at the radio yesterday when I heard David Lammy on the World at One banging on about how we cannot have nuclear proliferation, something I totally agree with, but the UK has just been nuclear proliferating by this green light to £15 billion for our nuclear weapons. So what he really means to say is that we can have nuclear weapons, but other countries can't, which in my view is a pretty hypocritical and unsustainable position to take. So it feels to me that at a time when we are breaking the terms of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, because that treaty has two main points. The point that people like David Lammy like to talk about is the point that says other countries should not seek to acquire nuclear weapons. The point that he's less keen to talk about is that the quid pro quo for that is for those nuclear armed countries to start to take disarmament much more seriously. And there is a UN treaty now that was set up in 2017, the treaty to ban nuclear weapons, and 93 countries have already ratified that. So around half the world have already ratified this treaty. And yet what we're seeing, I think, now is a lesson that Iran and I fear other countries might learn from the last few weeks, is that actually, if you want to be safe, then you need to be like North Korea. You need to get nuclear weapons. And so one of the inadvertent impacts of Donald Trump's policy might well be that, in fact, there's more of a push for people to try to get nuclear weapons because they feel as if they've got them, then that stops other countries lobbing bombs at them. But a world in which all of us have nuclear weapons feels 100 times more dangerous than a world in which we try to be serious about the UN treaties and about our existing obligations, and that we try to move towards disarmament.
Absolutely. I mean, also, this week is a environmental week here in the Conduit. So I think one of my last questions is about net zero and how practical it is till 2025 the UK can achieve net zero, and what that means, because that also means the fighting with the idea of the growth, because if the economy will be how many times, 3 times, 4 times larger than now, how practical the net zero can be achieved. You would know a bit better because your research.
Well, I mean, I think it is true to say that at the moment, climate policy feels as if it's kind of in a compartment over here, and economic policy is over there, and the two aren't always meeting as often as they should. And so I think there are very real questions about how does it become sustainable to be expanding airports, let's say, which is part of the government's plans, and to be going ahead with many of their other economic policies, if we are also trying to stay within the parameters of keeping our emissions below 1.5. And there are certainly ways to do it. I absolutely believe that it's possible, but it requires rather more political will and prioritization than I see at the moment. And I also think that there's also this huge backlash, as we're seeing from the Tories who used to be in favor of climate. I mean, even Boris Johnson, for all his many sins, was actually more or less in favor of saying that we ought to deal with climate change, whereas Kemi Badenoch has just kind of ripped that up. She's on record as saying that it's totally impossible, and then you've got Richard Tice and Nigel Farage also from Reform UK is saying similar things. I found out the other day a rather lovely little bit of information, which was that Richard Tice's constituency, Richard Tice being the deputy of Reform UK, his constituency of Boston and Skegness is the second most prone to flooding in the whole of the country. So when he bangs on about net stupid zero and basically tears up existing obligations, and his councillors basically dismantle any kinds of work that's going on to try to protect communities from extreme flooding, let's say, then I hope his constituents will be queuing up outside his door, no doubt wearing their Wellington boots, to point out that actually they are the ones who are going to be suffering from this policy. So I think we need to be really robust. I think we need to change some of our language. Frankly, I think that the Green movement as a whole haven't done ourselves any favors by talking about net zero, which means nothing to most people. What is that about? Biodiversity, what's that about? You know, that doesn't make you feel about some kind of connection that you have with the natural world that you love. It sounds like some kind of washing powder. You know, we haven't been very savvy about the kinds of language that we've used to kind of bring people along with us on this climate journey. And one of the pieces of work that I'm involved in at the moment is actually focusing on adaptation to climate change, not instead of reducing our emissions, but recognizing that being alongside people in their communities, working with them to make their communities more resilient, I think is a way of making the climate threat more real and more tangible and more visible. And in a way, as well as helping to protect people more from the climate change that's already baked in, I think it is a way as well of reinforcing why action on climate is so important. So I think we need to be a bit wiser about some of the strategies that we're using to push back against the right, because now we've kind of lost this consensus that we had in this country for many years that climate change was real and that human beings were causing it, and there are things we could do to reduce our risks. And that very precious consensus has now been really damaged, I think.
And then your last section in the book, I think beautifully also practically listed the possibilities what we can do, right, with England now and in relation to climate crisis and the political change. And these are wonderful updates in this vision, in this edition. So I hope you get it. And I hope Keir Starmer read the last section. Do you think if he didn't, then it's a huge mistake he made in his political career without reading your last section. So we better check. I think this is a good time to open to the floors. Any questions? Yes.
I think there's a microphone coming just so that...
Caroline, in your question about growth, you mentioned society and well-being and measuring growth in different ways. But it seems that all of the debate in society at the moment is driven by the right. How do we make the debate much more centred around society and community, and how we can adapt that in a more positive way to draw on these sorts of more positive growth dimensions that you refer to?
I mean, it's a very good question, how best to actually do that. There are some amazing people working in this space. I mean, people I'm sure you've heard of, like Kate Rayworth, who's done all of the work on so-called donut economics, where she talks about a kind of economic model that makes sure that the people who are the most impoverished are able to have the space to grow, and so their needs are met. But on the outside circle of the donut, we don't kind of exceed all of the different kinds of environmental limits that we have, whether that's to do with pollution or to do with climate change. So there are some imaginative and some exciting ideas out there that are looking at ways of communicating this stuff in a way that is a bit more tangible and compelling than simply banging people over the head with more and more numbers. But that question about how we make it real for people, I think, is one that we haven't got a very good answer to yet, because all of the evidence is on our side. I mean, all of the evidence from people like the New Economics Foundation, who've been working for years on demonstrating that if you have exponential growth over time, then you just basically bust the limits of the planet. And crucially, that money is not going to people who need it the most. So trying to get the idea of redistribution higher up the agenda rather than growth, I think is something that people have been thinking about for a long time. And maybe one of the ways that we could try and do it a bit better just now would be to kind of join our voices to the many people who are talking about the need for wealth taxes right now. Because at the moment, you know, if, for example, you're looking at the issue around welfare and the welfare budget and the big conversations going on just now around the fact that around 100 Labour MPs apparently are trying to block the government's plans to cut welfare. Good on them, I'm glad they are. But then people point out, well, then there's going to be a £5 billion hole in the government's budget, and that means we're going to have to grow something else very quickly. Well, one option would be to grow something else. That doesn't tend to happen very quickly, but we'll park that for now. But why can we not look at some of the many, many ways that there are out there for taxing wealth better? We don't tax wealth in this country, we tax income. And so we let people off who've got their yachts and their lovely their lovely paintings and so forth. Because in a sense, if you can't go on growing forever as a way of trying to ensure that everyone has a decent quality of life, then what you can do is put more stress on redistribution. And it seems to me that something where I think we could get more people behind us if they recognize that it was a realistic possibility, is around really pushing the government far more on a whole range of different kind of wealth taxes that some brilliant groups are working on. There's a group called the Patriotic Millionaires who literally do what it says on the tin. They're basically saying, tax us more, we are in favor of paying more. And again, some of the wonderful work that's been done by people like Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, who wrote a book many years ago now called The Spirit Level. And what was unique about that book, in a way, was demonstrating that an unequal society, which we have par excellence in the UK, an unequal society is not only bad for people at the bottom of the ladder, which is fairly obvious, but on so many ways, on so many criteria, it's bad for people even who are higher up that ladder because there's more crime, because there's more ill health, because there's less cohesion and a sense of belonging and so forth. So I think we can make a very strong case for why growth is not the answer, or at least a kind of indiscriminate growth is not the answer going forward. But I absolutely agree with the point of your question, really, is we need to get better ways of communicating that, for sure.
We have a question here. Yeah. Mike.
It's probably worth waiting because I think there's people online and they wouldn't hear you without it.
Thank you so much. I'm interested in the fact that climate is such a divisive word nowadays. I think it's probably worse in the US. And I'm exploring in my work a lot whether we should be talking to people in the UK about what they want in the future. For example, you know, everyone wants clean air, everyone wants seas they can swim in, a livable future for their children, but without using the word climate. Because I think, you know, there are many people around the UK who like the fact that solar panels, you know, make their bills less in their house. They've got a cool Tesla they're proud of, although it's not so cool nowadays. But they still are very scared, or maybe they're not scared, they just don't like the word climate and they don't agree with it. They think it's a political agenda. They don't see the kind of societal impacts or the aims behind the movement. What do you think is the key to bridging the political divide in pursuit of climate action in the UK, and making it not so much of a left-right issue?
I mean, I think that's such an important question, and I very much agree with you that the kind of weaponization of climate policy means that it's become part of the culture wars, and it's become a really kind of fraught and contested term. Whereas, as you say, if you actually talk about whether or not people want to have their homes properly insulated and lots of the other benefits from taking climate action, then they're perfectly up for it. And that's why, in a way, I've been spending some time with this campaign called the Climate Majority Project, and they've set up a campaign called SAFER, which is a mouthful because SAFER stands for Strategic Adaptation for Emergency Resilience, which I didn't come up with that, they did. But anyway, so the point about it is, though, is a little bit that I was saying earlier around maybe we can reach more people through talking around making their communities more resilient than we do about lecturing them, as they might feel, about a colourless, odourless gas that needs to be eradicated at some time in the distance, which actually means nothing to them when they're worrying about how to put food on the table tomorrow. And I think there's something about that adaptation piece that makes the issue far more real and people can see the benefits in their everyday lives, and it's important to them. So I think trying to do exactly as you say in a way, which is to talk about or not even to talk about, but to demonstrate the benefits of taking action that we might have called climate action in the past, but we might now call community resilience or something like that in the future. Because if we don't do that, I do really worry that that this toxification is only going to grow. And just one last point, because I know sometimes people worry that adaptation to the climate reality is kind of in opposition to mitigation, in other words, getting our emissions down. And the more I've thought about it, the more I disagree with that. I think the two are really intimately linked, and actually we can probably mobilize more people to recognize the need for mitigation when they recognize that there are limits to what you can adapt to. We can adapt to certain things. We can make our homes more flood resilient, and we can make them cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter. But when it comes to a whole set of climate impacts, fires and droughts and food shortages and so on, there are limits to how much we can adapt. So to me, there could be a kind of a sweet spot, I think, around that point.
Yeah, we have time for one more or two more questions. Let's do one more for now.
Mike is already with me, so can I ask the question?
Oh, yeah.
Great. I think that's a perfect segue to continue talking about messaging. In the last presidential election, only 40% of the youth voter participation happened in the United States, so it's at a historical low point. And according to the most recent survey, only 30% of the youth voters trust federal government. I don't know much about UK politics, but I think the stats are quite similar. So my understanding is that politicians on left and right have shown very technical knowledge about the new technology, sustainability, artificial intelligence. So in this political climate, what's your next step in terms of engaging the young voters? Because there's clearly a disconnect, whether you are Green Party or Conservative or any party, there's a very huge disconnect with the young voters. So yeah, really just want to hear about how would you like to proceed?
Thank you for the question. I mean, I think there's a difference between young people feeling turned off the political system and young people not necessarily feeling motivated around climate. I feel that from the evidence that I've seen, that young people are deeply concerned around what's happening to their lives, their communities, their planet. But at the same time, they are deeply skeptical about the either ability or even willingness of politicians to take action. And that is a terrible position that we've put young people in, to be honest. And I think it's no surprise that there are rising levels of mental ill health and anxiety among young people. Certainly in this country, it's a very major issue. And I'm not saying all of that's to do with climate, but I think that underlying sense of anxiety and the gap between what, on the one hand, they might hear around what the reality is of accelerating climate change, and yet then what they're actually being taught in schools, which is quite often not really addressing that, leads to even further kind of disconnections. So I think it's really important that we find ways of enabling young people to confront the difficulties of their emotional response to a world that is changing so fast. And in a way, their emotional response to it is entirely legitimate and understandable and normal. If you were not worried about where we're sitting right now, then that might suggest that that's more of a cause for concern. And so, sorry to keep banging on about the Climate Majority Project, but another of their campaigns is called the Climate Courage Campaign. And what they're trying to do is to call on the government to both mandate more climate education and environmental education in schools, but to accompany that with the kind of emotional support and emotional regulation, if you like, for young people to be able to feel that they can explore difficult feelings and know how to cope with them, and to feel better equipped to deal with them, and to make the space for even people to acknowledge that. And frankly, we don't just need it among young people. I think we could do with it, across the board, quite honestly. So I think part of my answer to your question is that A, we need to change the way our politics works. That's a very big thing to do, and we can't wait to deal with climate change until we've sorted out the corruption in politics, the dirty money, the fact that politicians say one thing and do another, the fact that we have an appalling voting system in both the States and here in the UK. I mean, there are lots of very good reasons why people feel fed up with the political system. Part of our concern needs to be around that. But in the meantime, I think also finding ways of communicating honestly in our schools in particular around the reality of the climate and nature breakdown that people are seeing, but also to increase the emotional support we give to young people to deal with some of those feelings and to feel agency as a result. Because I think unless you're going to feel some agency over it, the whole thing can feel so overwhelming that it's not surprising that you would just, push it out of your mind and try and go and do something else.
Carla, I think you also achieved a lot in terms of pushing young people engage with politics. First, you campaigned and succeeded to adding the natural history in the GCSE, right, in the English school.
Thank you.
I mean, that's something I think is enormous to promote that in our school system. And second, isn't I think the young green membership growing? It's quite amazing.
That's true. That is true. Yes. So there are things that buck the trend. So young Greens in this country anyway are growing fast. It's one of the fastest growing parts of our party. So young people are very politically engaged, and of course they were hugely engaged in things like XR as well, Extinction Rebellion, and the Fridays, the Fridays for Future campaign. So they are doing more than their bit, I feel. But if I can just end on the GCSE, just because again it would be nice to have a bit of good news. So basically, Mary Colwell, who's a writer and campaigner, came up with this idea of having a new GCSE in natural history. And she's been working on it since, I think, 2011 or 2012. And I got to know her about 5 years ago. And together we've worked to try to get this GCSE accepted. And finally it was under the Tories. And then they didn't introduce it quickly enough. So then there was the general election. And then Labour said, well, if it was a Tory plan, we don't want anything to do with it. So we then had to kind of persuade them it wasn't a Tory plan and they should have something to do with it. But it should be in our schools in 2027. And the reason I think it matters so much, this comes back to a wonderful writer called Richard Louv, who wrote a book called Last Child in the Wood. And he said, we won't protect what we don't love, and we won't love what we don't know, and we won't know what we don't touch and smell and taste and feel and hear. And when it comes to the natural world, the shocking statistic is that prisoners spend more time in the natural world than our young kids on an average. People are not out in the natural world in the way they were generations ago. So finding ways of enabling young people to be in nature and to know it and to feel familiar with it and intimate with it and feel that they belong in it, and then to hopefully feel that they then become even more mobilized and motivated to protect it feels so important. So I think in terms of the net sum of joy in the world and in terms of the possibility of being able to really kind of take action to protect our natural world, then this GCSE, I hope, will be a very important step forward.
Absolutely, yeah. This feels like a great ending, but I think there's two eager questions. We allowed to have one more? Okay, please.
If you just hang on a minute, okay.
Thank you so much, both of you, for being here today. It's been really uplifting listening to this conversation. My question for you, Caroline, was, I've really loved the work you're doing on storytelling. I think it's so important. It's what the left needs right now in general, as well as the Green movement. But I suppose my question is we're talking about storytelling, but who do you think is telling those stories? Where are they being told? Is this a narrative that is for the left only? Is it, building consensus? I would just love to hear a bit more about that.
Such a good question. And yes, so the question is, who's doing the telling of the stories? And related to that, I guess, is also where are the stories being told? And on that latter point, we haven't had time to touch on it this afternoon, but the huge monopolies that exist in our national press, for example, is a real concern. And the fact that quite a lot of the places where people might find some of these stories are in the hands of people like Rupert Murdoch, who doesn't necessarily have much interest in telling those stories. So I think there's part of, again, along so many other things we need to do, but part of what we need to do is to regulate the media, regulate social media, so that social media is properly treated as a publisher, not just as some kind of neutral platform that they pretend has got nothing to do with their algorithms. So that's in terms of how the story gets out there. I think who's telling the stories and who are they telling them to? I think I agree with what I understood maybe to be what you were saying, which was that this isn't just for the left. I think we've got to find stories that can speak right across the spectrum. I've said that the left tend to be spectacularly bad at it, but that's not to say that they couldn't get better, or indeed that we couldn't find stories that are equally applicable across the board. And, you know, stories that are around the deep love that we have for the countryside, for example, feels like that's an area where that doesn't need to be a party political point. It can be just something that we recognize and celebrate and realize that it's very long standing and something we want to protect going forward. And so, you know, maybe one way of reaching some of those people on the right who don't necessarily want to get excited about biodiversity standards, they might get excited about the fact that actually their sweet peas have come a month late, or the insects that are usually in their garden are not there, or the butterflies that they would normally have seen have gone. So I think we can find different ways of telling those stories that are applicable across the board, and I think it's really important that we do, because polarization is just increasing so much.
I'm nervous about putting a dampener on this. I've worked in across all the UN SDGs, and it's the ones that I wonder are really about the health and well-being, and how maybe we can draw people's interest in nature and biodiversity back by making people realize how much healthier they can be if they get back into nature, and that we can lift the nation up that way.
Yeah.
Because I mean, that's sort of the work that I do, and I just see people recovering from so many things when we make their dark spaces greener and wetter in the appropriate way, not in the flooding way, obviously, but by breaking down land drains.
Yeah.
And putting in suds and things like that.
That is such a good point. Yeah. I mean, I think addressing lots of the issues we've been talking about this afternoon through the prism of health is really effective. I mean, it reaches people who might not be interested in some of these issues otherwise, but if they recognize that actually this is about increasing their own health and well-being and that of their kids as well, then that I think is very motivational. And there's so much evidence, as you know, and as you've indicated, around how access to green spaces, you know, makes such a huge difference in terms of people's sense of well-being. There's even been research just shown that if you're in a hospital bed recovering from some illness, and if you've got a window on green space, your recovery time is that much faster, which I think is just, I just love the empirical evidence of that. I mean, it feels, you know, psychologically, intuitively right, but I love the fact that's now actually been evidenced with someone who's done some research on that. So yeah, health, I think, is a really important way of communicating and of galvanizing people to act, because I think it means that people can recognize some instant benefits. And then when they get along that kind of that train of thought, hopefully other benefits will become clearer to them as well. But it's a very good starting point. I absolutely agree.
And in your book, I think you do mention the BBC and NHS as two huge, the biggest public institution, how it worked, and then how it kind of shifted its power and importance. I want to thank you, everyone being here, listening. And of course, thank you, Caroline, for your generous answer. You talk fast, but I think you can do another 5 hours, more than most of politicians. But I have great admiration for your work as well. I think you should get the copies signed already over there. And thank you, the Conduit, to host this event. Thank you.
I should say, just thank you so much for being here, but thank you as well to you, Jalou, and people should definitely buy your book about Hastings. It's wonderful. So thank you.